They didn't hit me with fists. They hit me with silence, with locked accounts, and a key I was never allowed to keep. I was 68 years old when I realized the bruises on my spirit were just as real as any others, and just as worth surviving. This is the story of how I walked out with nothing and built something they could never take back. I want to tell you something true before I tell you anything else. The most dangerous kind of cruelty doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come in through the front door swinging. It comes in slowly, over years, wearing the clothes of love. Reasonable clothes, practical clothes, the kind you don't think twice about until one morning. You look in the mirror and realize you can't remember the last time you chose what to wear. My name is Loretta Mae Finch. I was born in a small river town in Tennessee, the third of 5 children, in a house that smelled like pine soap and whatever was on the stove. My mother had strong hands and a stronger laugh. She taught me that a woman's voice was worth hearing, that it was worth raising when the moment called for it. I believed her. I believed her for a long time. I met Douglas Hargrove at a church social in the autumn of 1978. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had this way of listening, really listening, that made you feel like the most important person in the room. I was 22 and had never been made to feel important by a man before. Not like that. Not with that particular quality of attention that can make a young woman feel chosen. We married the following spring. The azaleas were blooming along the church steps. My mother cried. My youngest sister, Pearl, danced on the lawn with her shoes off. I still have a photograph of that day somewhere me in a dress. I sewed myself, Douglas with his hand at the small of my back, both of us squinting into the afternoon sun, with the particular brightness of people who believe the best is still ahead. For a while it was. We built a life. We moved to a small brick house on Sycamore Lane, the kind of neighborhood where everybody knew everybody, and the kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. I found work at the county library, a job I loved deeply, surrounded by the smell of old paper, and the particular satisfaction of helping a person find exactly the book they needed. Douglas worked in construction management. We were not rich, but we were steady, which in those years felt like a kind of grace. Our daughter, Renee, came in 1982. She had Douglas's dark eyes and my stubborn chin, and from her first breath, she seemed to know exactly what she wanted from the world. Our son, Carl, followed 3 years later, quieter, more careful, the kind of child who watched before he leaped. I adored them both in the way that you can only adore the things you have made with your own body, with the full knowledge that they are not yours to keep. The shifting started so gradually. I cannot point to a single moment and say that was when it changed. It was more like weather than event, a pressure building slowly, a slow drop in temperature that you notice only once you're already cold. It started with small corrections. The way I cooked the rice, the route I drove to the grocery store, the friends I spent time with. Douglas always had a reason, always had a logic for each adjustment, and his logic was the kind that made you feel foolish for disagreeing. He wasn't mean about it. That would have been easier to name. He was patient, methodical, the way you might teach a child, a lesson you believed they were slow to learn. After a while, I stopped taking the long route to the grocery store. After a while, I stopped seeing Diane from the library on weekends. After a while, I stopped cooking the rice any other way. By the time Renee was in high school, I had stopped calling things by their real names. I called it his preferences. I called it keeping the peace. I called it the natural way of 2 people learning to live together. I had 100 names for it, and none of them were the right one. The financial control came later and quietly. My library salary went into a joint account that Douglas managed. There were reasons for this too. He was better with numbers. He had a system. He liked to know things were handled. I told myself I was lucky to have someone who cared so much about the practical matters. I told myself a lot of things in those years that I have since had to unlearn. The last winter on Sycamore Lane, I was 67 years old, and I had $11 in a wallet in my purse, and no clear knowledge of what was in our bank account. I had not been to the doctor alone in 4 years. I had not had dinner with my sister Pearl in 2. My daughter Renee called every Sunday, and every Sunday she asked how I was. And every Sunday I told her, I was fine, everything was fine, because I did not yet have the language for what it was I actually was. It took a Tuesday in February to break that open. A Tuesday with a cold rain and a stopped-up kitchen drain. And a phone call from Pearl that Douglas didn't know about. Pearl asking in her plain-spoken way, Loretta, honey, are you happy? And something in me, some small locked room I had forgotten even existed, swung open all at once. I sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, rain tapping the window. I sat there for a long time, and for the first time in more years than I could count, I stopped explaining things to myself. I just sat with what was true. I was not fine. I had not been fine. And somewhere underneath all the adjustments, and the quiet corrections and the $11 in my wallet, I was still there. Still Loretta Mae Finch from the river town in Tennessee, who believed a woman's voice was worth hearing. I just had to find it again. They tell you the hardest part of leaving is the fear. And the fear is real, I won't pretend otherwise. But what they don't tell you, what nobody warns you about in the brochures or the hotline scripts, is that the hardest part is actually the grief. The grief for the life you thought you had. The grief for the person you were before you started making yourself smaller. The grief for a marriage that was real once, in the way that all things are real before they shift into something unrecognizable. I didn't leave that February. Not yet. I got up off the kitchen floor, unclogged the drain, and started dinner. But I had made a small, quiet decision, the kind that lives in your chest before it lives in your actions. I decided to start paying attention. I found her number through a pamphlet tucked inside a donated book at the library, a resource guide for older women, slipped between the pages of a gardening memoir, as if placed there by someone who knew I'd be the one to find it. The Hearthside Center, a domestic violence resource organization for women over 50. I'd never thought of those words as applying to me. Domestic violence. The phrase conjured images of emergency rooms and visible injuries, not a woman standing in her own kitchen feeling like a stranger in her own life. I folded the pamphlet and put it in my coat pocket. I carried it for 6 weeks before I called. The woman who answered was named Gloria. She had a voice like warm coffee, unhurried, matter of fact, not a flicker of judgment in it. I told her I wasn't sure I was in the right place, that nothing had ever been physical, that my husband was not a bad man, not exactly, that I was probably overreacting. She let me finish. Then she said quietly, Loretta, control is control. It doesn't need to leave a mark to leave a mark. I called her again the following week, and the week after that. Those calls were the first time in years I had told the truth about my own life to another human being, and the telling was both a relief and a terror, the way confessing something you've held too long always is. In the meantime, I began to prepare, slowly, carefully, with the patience of a woman who had learned to move through her own home without disturbing the air. I opened a bank account in my maiden name Loretta Finch at a credit union across town. I deposited what I could from my library pay before Douglas reviewed the joint statements. Small amounts, irregular. The way you save when you're saving in secret. I contacted the county's legal aid office and spoke to a young attorney named Marcus, who explained in plain language what my options were. He had a calm, serious face and didn't flinch at the details. He told me I had more rights than I'd been led to believe. Most women do. I called Pearl and told her the truth. Not all of it at once. I didn't have all of it at once, but enough. Pearl cried. Then she stopped crying and got practical, which is the most Pearl thing in the world. She said, "You tell me what you need and when you need it, and I'll be there." I wrote her address on a card I kept tucked inside my copy of Middlemarch, a book Douglas had never touched. The leaving itself happened on a Thursday in April. Douglas had a regional conference 3 days in Atlanta. I had known for months it was coming. I had the time memorized the way you memorize something essential, a phone number or a medication schedule. That Thursday morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked around at the house I had lived in for 31 years, and I tried to feel everything I was supposed to feel: sadness, nostalgia, the weight of so much time. Mostly what I felt was a strange, clear calm. I packed 2 suitcases. I was deliberate about it. A photograph of Renee and Carl at the beach when they were small. My mother's silver bracelet, the one I always meant to get repaired. My library cardigan, the blue one I wore on busy days. My copy of Middlemarch, the folder of documents I had quietly been assembling my Social Security card, my birth certificate, the retirement account statement in my own name, the letter from Marcus outlining my legal position. I left Douglas a note on the kitchen table. Not an explanation. I owed him nothing there, but a plain statement of fact. I wrote, "I am leaving. I am safe. Please do not contact me." I left the house key on top of it. Pearl was waiting in her car at the end of the block. She had driven 6 hours. She was eating a granola bar and listening to public radio when I walked up. And she got out of the car and held me for a long time without saying anything, which is exactly what I needed her to do. We drove north as the afternoon light went golden over the highway, and I watched the Tennessee hills roll past, and I felt something strange and unexpected. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but space. The specific interior quality of space that comes when you stop using all your energy to hold something in place that was never right to begin with. I was 67 years old. I had $11 in my old wallet, and a growing sum in a new account, and a sister driving, and a folder of documents that proved I was a person with a legal existence and a future. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Pearl's house in Knoxville smelled like wood smoke, and the lemon verbena she kept in clay pots along the windowsills. She had the 3rd bedroom made up fresh sheets, a small lamp, a glass of water on the nightstand, the kind of hospitality that doesn't announce itself but simply is. I put my 2 suitcases against the wall and sat on the edge of the bed and thought, this is the first room that is only mine in 31 years. The next few months were not easy. I want to be honest about that because the stories we tell about survival have a tendency to skip past the hard middle, the part between leaving and arriving somewhere new, as if the distance closes cleanly once the decision is made. It doesn't. There is so much middle. I saw a counselor at the Hearthside Center twice a week, a woman named Dr. Patrice Odom, who had the gift of asking questions that felt like invitations rather than interrogations. She helped me name what had happened to me over those 30 years, with something approaching accuracy: the financial control, the social isolation, the constant calibration of my behavior against his reactions. Coercive control, she called it. It was strange to have a clinical name for something I had lived inside for so long without a name. Naming it didn't make it smaller exactly. It made it real in a different way, the way a diagnosis can be both a relief and a weight. But with Dr. Odom, I began to understand that the confusion I felt, the persistent sense that I had somehow caused or deserved what had happened, was itself part of what had been done to me. This was important. This was, in fact, one of the most important things I have ever learned. I struggled with money, or rather with the psychology of money, after years of not having access to my own. I would stand in a grocery store holding a jar of expensive pasta sauce, heart beating fast, and I would put it back and reach for the generic because that was a reflex so deep in me it had become a kind of instinct. My counselor called this financial trauma. She said it would ease. She was right, but slowly. I started going to a weekly gathering at the Hearthside Center, a group of women, most of us over 50, who had survived various forms of domestic abuse. We met in a room with folding chairs and a good coffee maker and a facilitator named Wanda, who had a talent for holding silence when silence was what was needed. At first, I just listened. The stories were different in their details and the same in their architecture. The gradual narrowing, the growing self-doubt, the moment of clarity, the fear, the leaving, the aftermath. There was a woman named Sylvie, 72, elegant, who had left her husband of 40 years after discovering he had been moving money from their accounts into one she didn't know existed. There was Tammy, 58, who had finally told her children what was happening and been believed a word. She said with something that wasn't quite disbelief, just gratitude so large it didn't have a good container yet. There was June, 64, who arrived at the group carrying a small, potted cactus she said her daughter had given her because you don't have to water it every day. And I thought that felt right for me right now. I loved those women. I love them still. There is something that happens when you sit in a room with people who understand a specific kind of surviving, a recognition that goes beneath language, that doesn't require explanation. In the late summer, I got a part-time position at the Knoxville Public Library System, working 3 days a week in the reference department. My old professional references came through quickly. 30 years in libraries leaves a trail. The work steadied me in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't known the specific medicine of returning to a thing you are good at, after a period of believing yourself to be not much good at anything. I found an apartment in October, a one-bedroom in a neighborhood with good oak trees and a bakery on the corner. Pearl helped me move in. She brought a houseplant and a bottle of wine, and we sat on my floor eating takeout pizza among the boxes. And she said, "Loretta, look at you," in the way that means more than the words do. I looked. A 68-year-old woman, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her own apartment, her own key in her own pocket, her own name on her own door, her own jar of expensive pasta sauce in the cabinet, purchased without a second thought. I looked. I want to tell you about an ordinary Wednesday that turned out to be a turning point, because most turning points are disguised as ordinary Wednesdays. It was mid-November, and I was working the reference desk when a woman came in who I recognized in a way that had nothing to do with having met her before. She was maybe 60, maybe a bit older, wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather, carrying a canvas bag that looked like it held everything she currently owned in the world. She asked me quietly if I knew of any resources for women who needed housing assistance. I gave her everything I had. I gave her Hearthside Center's number, the legal aid office, the county housing authority, 3 websites, and the name of a woman named Gloria who would pick up the phone and not judge. I sat with her for 40 minutes. I bought her a coffee from the machine in the break room. When she left, she thanked me with the particular gratitude of someone who wasn't sure she deserved to be helped, and I held her hands briefly and said, "You deserve every bit of this." Please use it. I thought about her on the drive home. I thought about all the women I'd sat with at the Hearthside Center. I thought about how the help had been there for me, the pamphlet, Gloria's voice, Dr. Odom, the group Pearl, but only because someone had made it available, had decided it was worth the effort to build the infrastructure of a second chance. I called Gloria that evening. I want to do something, I said. I don't know what yet, but I want to use what I know. Gloria laughed her warm coffee laugh and said, Loretta, I've been waiting for you to say that. What followed was not a plan so much as a series of conversations that gradually accumulated into one. I spoke to the legal aid office about what older women specifically needed. I spoke to a social worker at the county who dealt with elder abuse cases. I spoke to 2 community foundations about funding. I spoke to my former colleague at the Knoxville Library who knew everyone in the city's nonprofit sector. The thing that kept coming up in every conversation was the same gap older women, particularly those who had experienced financial abuse, needed practical skills: how to open a bank account, how to understand a lease, how to read a legal document, how to navigate the benefits they were entitled to, alongside emotional support. The emotional support existed in fragments. The practical skills, education was nearly absent. I am a librarian. I have spent my entire professional life making complex information accessible to people who need it. I knew how to do this. With a small grant from a community foundation, a donated meeting room at my branch library, and the partnership of Hearthside Center, I started what we called Grounded, a 6-week workshop series for women over 50 who had experienced domestic or financial abuse. The first session had 7 participants. By the third session, 14. The waiting list reached 30 before we'd finished the first cohort. The content was practical financial literacy, legal rights, housing options, benefit navigation. But what happened in the room was something more than the content. It was women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s discovering or rediscovering that they were capable, that the uncertainty they felt about practical matters was the result of having been deliberately kept uncertain, not of any actual limitation in themselves. I watched women walk in apologizing for taking up space and walk out, asking questions in a full voice, and I cannot tell you what that looked like without my own eyes filling. We brought in a volunteer estate attorney. We brought in a bank officer who walked people through account setup without condescension. We brought in a grief counselor because you cannot separate the practical from the emotional. When you're rebuilding a life, they are the same project. Renee drove up from Nashville to see the third session. She sat in the back and watched, and afterward she stood in the parking lot and said, "Mom, how did you build this so fast?" I told her I hadn't built it fast, that I had been building it for 40 years without knowing it. Every woman I had ever helped find the right book, every difficult conversation I'd held quietly in the stacks, all of it had been preparation for something I couldn't see yet. I don't know if that's true or if it's a story I needed to tell myself. Maybe both. Maybe the stories we need to tell ourselves can also be true. There is a window in the grounded meeting room at the library that looks out onto the street, and when I arrive early on workshop days, I sometimes stand at it for a few minutes before anyone else comes in. Not for any particular reason, just to stand, just to be a person standing at a window in a room she helped build, watching the city move through its Tuesday or its Thursday morning. I am 70 years old as I write this. I have been out of Sycamore Lane for 3 years. The divorce was finalized 14 months ago, a process that was difficult and, at times, felt designed to be, but which ended cleanly enough, with a settlement that Marcus helped me negotiate and that represents, In concrete legal language, the 31 years I spent in that marriage. Douglas has remarried, I'm told. I don't think much about it. I am too busy thinking about other things. The Grounded program has now served 214 women. We are in discussions with 2 neighboring counties to expand. A graduate student at the University of Tennessee is studying our model for her social work thesis. I find this funny in a way I can't fully explain. That something born from my particular pain could be useful to future people as a kind of data, as evidence of what works. But that is what happens when you survive something with enough intention, it becomes information. It becomes a map. I still see Dr. Odom, though less frequently now. The work we do together has shifted from crisis navigation to something more like maintenance. The ongoing labor of understanding how your past has shaped your present and choosing, day by day, which parts of that shaping you want to keep. She told me once that recovery from long-term coercive control is not a destination you arrive at, but a practice you sustain. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. The question I get most often, from women in the workshops and from people who hear about my story through other channels, is, how did you find the strength? I understand why they ask it. I asked it about others before I had a reason to ask it about myself. But I have come to think the question contains a flawed premise. Strength is not something you find. It is not a lost thing you search for and locate. It is something that was always in you, something that was obscured, that had been systematically obscured, by someone who benefited from your not knowing it was there. The work is not finding the strength. The work is clearing away what was piled on top of it. Pearl came to visit last month. We sat in my apartment, the one with the oak trees and the bakery on the corner, and she told me I seemed different. Not in a vague way. She was specific. You sit differently, she said. You take up more room when you sit. You speak before the other person finishes talking. You make decisions like they're yours to make. I laughed because she was right, and because that is an extraordinary catalog of changes to observe in your sister. My daughter Renee is one of Grounded's board members. My son Carl sent a donation last year with a note that said, "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't know." I wrote back you couldn't have known what I hadn't said. That's what we're fixing. That exchange was one of the most important I have ever had. I want to say something now to whoever is reading this and recognizing themselves in it, not in the specific details, which are mine, but in the texture of it, the long, quiet erosion of self, the confusion, the complicated love for someone who did real harm, the belief that it was too late or too complicated to change anything. It is not too late. I have seen this proved 214 times in a room at the Knoxville Public Library, and I will continue seeing it proved every Thursday morning for as long as I am able to stand at that window and watch the women arrive. You are not too old. You are not the sum of what was taken from you. The person you were before the narrowing began. She is still in there, waiting with the particular patience of someone who has been waiting a long time and is very glad, finally, to see you. Come and find her. Bring someone you trust. Use the resources. Take the long route home. You have every right to take up all the space you need.